Зараз один з найважчих моментів нашої історії.
This is one of the most difficult moments in our history. The pressure on Ukraine is now at its most intense. Ukraine may now face a very difficult choice, either the loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner, or 28 difficult points, or an extremely harsh winter. The most difficult and further risk are life without freedom, without dignity, without justice, and believing someone who has already attacked us twice.
That major partner is the United States, who this week presented a framework to Kyiv to end Russia's war there. In a radio interview with Fox News, President Trump said that he had given Ukraine until Thursday to respond. Ukraine's government says that it is carefully reviewing the Trump administration plan. And earlier, President Zelensky held an urgent call with the leaders of Britain, Germany, and France to discuss this plan. The U.S. framework was drawn up in secret by the U.S. and Russia, without consultation from Kyiv or Europe. A draft seen by CNN shows the proposal includes the Kremlin's maximalist demands, requiring Kyiv to half the size of its army and cede all territory lost to Russia in the past 3.5 years of war. Under the draft framework, Luhansk and Donetsk would be recognized as de facto Russian territories, as well as Crimea, which has been occupied by Russia since 2014. Russia would also keep parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is in London. Our Kylie Atwood joins us from Washington, D.C. Nick, let's start with you. As we heard there, ominous words from President Zelensky, calling this one of the most difficult moments of the country's history. He went on to say, I will present arguments, I will persuade, I will offer alternatives, but we will definitely not give the enemy any reason to say that Ukraine does not want peace. Just talk about the predicament that President Zelensky, that Ukraine is put in now, and the brief phone call that we now know that President Zelensky had with Vice President Vance.
Yeah, I mean, key, I think, will be what was said in that phone call in the past. Vice President Vance has been, particularly in the Oval Office blowout earlier on this year, the one to deliver the harshest messages towards Zelensky. We don't know if that was the case here, but listening again to President Zelensky's address there to the nation, this does not sound like a president who's saying to Ukraine, we have to go along with this. The choice between dignity and losing a major ally, well, it's fairly clear what he's suggesting Ukrainians should choose there. The choice of 28-point plan or an extremely hard winter. They've had hard winters in the past. This is clearly a process, but what we don't know at this stage is precisely what concrete parts of a plan that was widely leaked, perhaps initially elements of it by Russia to show they were trying to get a peace process moving, perhaps then bits of it leaked by Ukraine and Europe in the hope, perhaps misguidedly, that the distinctly pro-Russian element of this plan would kind of torpedo it in the early stages. That hasn't happened, and instead it's kind of morphed now into this document that has a life of its own, clearly in which the Trump administration is deeply invested. There are things in there which would be militarily and politically, frankly, suicidal, to start a rhetoric on it for Zelensky. He can't cede territory, particularly in the domestic political bind he's in with the corruption scandal swirling around his inner circle. That would be a phenomenally hard ask. He certainly can't agree to elections in 100 days after the signing of a deal. Even if he's not on the ballot, he'll be creating an electoral process there, rush with demobilization, wartime, messing it up, that will create a government whose legitimacy will be questioned from day one. And he certainly, I don't think, can agree to some elements of the decisions that get made by Russia in this document about who gets to join NATO in the future. So even when you read the text of the early versions that we've been seeing leaked to the media here, it's clear this originated in the Russian language. Biana, you know, when you read certain elements of English that look like they may have started in Russian, there's some parts of this document that clearly hark too closely to that. What we don't know at this point, though, is exactly what modifications are being suggested, agreed, what precisely this pressure for Thursday is around. Do they expect that 28 points to be agreed then? Well, that's frankly impossible at this stage. But it's important to just quickly remember the timing here. Not only is domestic political pressure on Zelensky possibly at its worst since the start of this war with this corruption scandal, On the front lines, Pokrovsk is probably days, maybe weeks away from falling fully to the Russians. That's been fought over for over a year and will be a key victory that Moscow has been hankering for months. And they're also, Russia, moving fast in the Zaporizhia region, faster, I think, than anyone potentially thought. So a frontline emergency is coinciding with a domestic political crisis for Zelensky, and now with this extraordinary moment where he's had to address the Ukrainian people and say they may have to choose between their own dignity and keeping their key ally, the United States. We've seen pressure vacillate, and this pendulum of Trump's love of Kiev versus Moscow vacillate, but there's clearly an acute level here. If you're Ukraine, do you just remember how you survived the last time it got this bad, or do you think there's something different now?
Can I ask you, Nick, if you know exactly what, if any, involvement Ukraine had in this? Were they blindsided by this proposal? Because there had been some reporting that perhaps a Ukrainian official had also been in Florida meeting with Steve Witkoff, though the majority of this reporting seems to suggest that this was drafted between just Witkoff and Russian envoy Dmitry Kirillov themselves.
I think the simplest answer to that notion of secret meetings is if you look at the text, well, any influence Ukraine thought it had in these meetings or presence it thought it had in these meetings hasn't really resulted in a document that includes much, if anything at all, in their favor. Even the clause about reconstruction of Ukraine is very complexly phrased. It potentially gives the possibility of that money going to rebuild areas of Ukraine that are actually Russian occupied, and through complex mechanisms through which the US says it might get 50% of the profits, and other joint projects that the US and Russia will devise by themselves. Even that isn't really in Ukraine's favor. Yes, there's recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty in that document, but remember too, sovereignty of what? Doesn't necessarily guarantee there won't be a third invasion. So yes, maybe there has been Ukrainian input. Whether that's actually translated into a document that's now in front of Zelensky and Trump and even Putin potentially for discussion, or the input has been lost along the way, we don't know. And that's, I think, why this moment is so key. Because clearly Ukraine's sounding the alarm here, but we don't know the precise details of exactly what's concerning it.
Yeah, another party that was clearly not involved here from all of the reporting was Europe as a whole. Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you. Let's go to Kylie Atwood. And Kylie, what more are we learning about this phone call between President Zelensky and Vice President Vance? We think back to that first meeting in the Oval Office where the talking down to, the shouting between Vice President Vance towards President Zelensky was quite shocking to see. The relationship has improved a bit, but what do we know about this call today?
Well, listen, we don't actually know a whole lot about the call yet, but to your point, it is interesting that the vice president is even becoming a critical player in this conversation overall. Obviously, there were those dramatic moments in the Oval Office earlier this year, but J.D. Vance, the vice president, has not been someone who has been viewed as a behind-the-scenes operator when it comes to driving a solution to end the war in Ukraine. These have been roles that have really fell on the shoulders of Steve Witkoff, who we know is still very actively engaged in this portfolio. He's the one who worked with Kirill in order to come up with this new 28-point proposal, but also Keith Kellogg, who was the president's special envoy for Russia and Ukraine. He was really leading the talks with Ukraine. We have learned that Keith Kellogg has told people that he's planning to leave the administration earlier next year. That will create a bit of a gap, a dramatic gap, really, in terms of who the Ukrainians rely on to talk with the Trump administration. And J.D. Vance is signaling today, and we'll see if this, pans out, that he might be the person to begin to step up and, converse with the Ukrainians on how to drive a solution here. We also just heard from President Trump in an interview with Fox that next Thursday is the deadline that he is giving the Ukrainians to agree to this 28-point plan that the U.S. and the Russians have worked on together that was presented to the Ukrainians Ukrainians just yesterday by the U.S. Army Secretary in Ukraine. President Trump also appeared to give some buffer room to that, saying that when things are going well, deadlines often change. So he's indicating that if the Ukrainians are effectively engaging, maybe that deadline for agreeing to this specific plan could change. But listen, it comes off of administration officials telling us that this leaked proposal was not necessarily the final proposal, but then you have President Trump saying that the Ukrainians have a week to agree to it. So even if it's not the final version, it does, in fact, have a lot of elements that the Trump administration is robustly behind, and that's significant. I also think it's important to point out that the administration is working off of this Gaza framework. They believe that this 20-point plan that they presented that led to a ceasefire in Gaza was effective. They're using that sort of framework to apply to try and end the Ukraine war. We'll watch and see how that plays out. These are very different conflicts, but the administration clearly feels that they have the wind at their backs in terms of, solving these crises that President Trump set out to solve, but has personally said have been very challenging for him to find a solution to.